Amen. It's good to praise Him. Isn't it good to shake off the week, to step into the presence and the glory of God and experience Him? It's a huge blessing to us. The Sabbath is not a burden. To worship Him is not a burden. It is, as it's embracing life itself. Amen. Well, in the archway in ancient Greece of the temple that was in Delphi, it had inscribed above it as you would enter into it. It says, "Know thyself." It was a saying that to enter in, that you were to know who you were, to understand who you were, and that was a lifelong goal to understand. In the old house here in Marietta, I had a framed picture that had that saying. It said, "Know thyself." And I had a little rose that was underneath it. And sometimes people would look at it and say, "Well, why do you have a rose there?" And I said, well, because every rose has its thorn. I'm not going to sing the song. But it was a point, is no matter how beautiful we become, we still have a thorn. And what is the thorn that we bear? Sin, yeah. Our brokenness, the part of our humanity that's still in process of being healed. Anybody think you're a rose without thorns? Let's talk afterwards, and a big hug, because I want to meet you. The reality is that no matter how beautiful we become on this earth, we will still retain that thorn. I had another plaque that picture, and it was actually a quote from Alexander Hamilton. It said, let's see if I can get it right. It's been a long time since I've recited it. "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." But sadly, I never got around to putting it up. So, the reality of knowing who you are is the part of this process that we call walking His way. When we come to faith, it is beginning that process of knowing who we are. We may know parts of ourselves that we don't like very much. And what do we generally try to do with those parts? Hide them. What else? Accentuate the positives. To offset. We try to medicate ourselves to avoid dealing with it. But the process of salvation is knowing the brokenness and dealing with it, with the power and through God. He tells us to wash our robes, to make our robes spotless, which is our life, spotless, and without wrinkle. And we said, I think last week, the washing part, we can definitely participate in that. We can participate in the spots, washing those spots out. But we also said, it was a kind of interesting thing that I came to, was linen, as we are described in the book, in several books that describe the clothing of people in heaven, is linen robes. There's nothing you could do to keep it from wrinkling. But by God's power, we can be without wrinkle as well. If you turn over to Proverbs chapter 4, Proverbs chapter 4 and verse 23. He says, the prophet King Solomon says, "Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it spring issues of life." Somebody give me another translation of that. Somebody have a different one? This is
Proverbs 4:23, you said?
Yes.
"Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it."
Okay, so guard your heart, from everything that you do flows from it. Okay, does anybody else have a different translation from that?
Above everything else, guard your heart, for it is the source of life's consequences.
Okay, so interesting, different translations kind of bring out different nuances, but the reality is that the heart, we have to guard it, because from it comes who we are, really. And the reality is that, unfortunately, there's both fresh water and salt water flowing from it. I drank a quart of salt water this morning. It was yummy. Anyway, so not so good. But again, the salt water represents the impure things from us. And it's, again, we have to understand ourselves. So, see, continuing, it says, "For they are life to those who find them, and health to all their flesh. Keep your heart with all diligence." Sorry, I'm going backwards here. blah, blah, blah. Put away from you a deceitful mouth and perverse lips far from you. You say anything this week that you regretted? Boy, I sure did. Anybody think anything that you really regretted? If I had more than two hands, I'd put it up there. But no, it's just being honest with ourselves. And we're not going to fall back into the modern, oh, well, I'm just like everybody else. No, that's a cop-out. That's an excuse to avoid dealing with it. Take ownership of it. It's us. And then place it before the feet of the King. Continuing, it says, let your eyes look straight ahead and your eyelids look right before you. Ponder the path of your feet and let all of your ways be established. Do not turn to the right or to the left, but remove your foot from evil. And he's speaking of course, the metaphorical halakha, the way to walk, the path. There's the righteous path. Now, sometimes I've heard it said it is a straight path, and other times I've heard it is a winding path. But the important thing to remember is you don't want to get off onto the left side of the path or the right side of the path. You stay on the path. And the path leads to God. So in this we've talked about before the parable of the Good Samaritan, where God is the Good Samaritan who finds the broken person, which you and me, takes care of him, puts him on his own donkey, his body, Messiah does, because he's the one who gave his body for us. And he is on this path to the inn, which is the healing place. And he therefore takes us and puts us there in a healing place. And the inn wasn't just an inn as much as it was a hospital. And it was a place where that poor man, who was a Jew, by the way, could be healed. And that's been a beautiful, I guess you could say, understanding of the parable in a particular way. If you see yourself as the broken and one who is beaten by robbers, which is our own brokenness and the fallen ones, then we know that it is he who takes us up. Remember what the Good Samaritan poured into the wounds of the one who had fallen or been beaten? What's that? Oil and wine. So again, beautiful symbols. If you encourage you to go back and read the parable with kind of that understanding of it and see what you see. So it is the reality is we have to understand what the path is in order to stay on it. When we step off the path, it's sometimes it's really easy to see in ourselves, and sometimes it's not. If we find ourselves in a prolonged period of time where we are not worshiping God, where we are not experiencing Him, or we're distracted with things, sometimes life happens. But sometimes we get distracted and fixated on something, and that's just part of our nature. And we neglect God, and we neglect going before Him and seeing ourselves for the sake of this, whatever that is. If you turn over to 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. In verse 1, it says, "Therefore, laying aside all malice, all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and all evil speaking." Ouch. Does he really have to do that? Can't we be like, a little bit, crotchety? Well, we all have those moments. But he says very specifically, lay aside these things. Why do you think he would say that to us about these particular things? These are symptoms that the doctor is saying. What do you think that we should see when we see those symptoms? Malice, where does that come from? How would we be malicious towards somebody?
We're jealous.
Okay, being jealous towards them.
Or if they've hurt us and we want vengeance.
Maliciousness is hating this person so much for whatever reason it is. And we do things, it's like maliciousness isn't just a thought per se, it's an action. But isn't it nice to get back at people? Don't we feel really good afterwards? Maybe for a minute, but then we go, yeah, it wasn't worth it. It really wasn't worth it. In reaching out to justify ourselves, attack them, we actually injure ourselves even more than what they have done to us. And so malice is one of those deep things that is actually a symptom of something else. What else does he say? Envy. What's envy?
Wanting what others have.
Okay. You know, when somebody gets a new car, you ever go, yeah, I'm happy for you. You feel happy for them because they got a new car, but do you ever think to yourself, why wasn't it me? Again, little tinges. It isn't wrong necessarily to desire something, but it's when we go, whether it's in our conscious or our subconscious, and we just don't like this person, or we find reasons to not like them simply because we're envious of them. Again, these are symptoms of something else. Hypocrisy. Anybody like dealing with hypocrisy? What is hypocrisy? Saying something and doing another, yeah. It's putting on a good show, but in reality, it's not what's there. Who did Yeshua call hypocrites? Some of the Pharisees, okay. And why did he call them that? What did they do?
They put on a show for people.
Okay.
Were big in words on the outside, but they didn't practice what they preached.
Okay. They did stuff so that they looked really good. They dressed right. They said everything right. They tithed really right. They got right down to the. He says that you tithe upon a mint, cumin, and something else. Do you remember the third? Now, we're not talking about ground cumin, which makes me hungry just thinking about it. But cumin seeds are pretty tiny. So how do you think that, and again, he was making, which is what we Jews do, is we exaggerate something to make a point. He's saying, you spend so much time tithing off of every little seed, but you neglect the weightier matters, which is what? What's that? Faith and mercy. Yeah. So he was saying the roots of hypocrisy are, as somebody said earlier, rooted in justifying our behavior by accentuating our more positive things, or putting on a show when that's not really who we are. Now, it's not an excuse to be mean simply because we're mean, because that's who we are. That's not an excuse. It's saying, it's taking ownership of that, but it's very much a realization of who we are. Anybody ever say something but not really mean it in the way that it came across? Again, 2 hands raised. And you know what we do whenever that happens? We apologize. We make an effort. But you know what else we do beyond that? Is we take note of that and we look for patterns in our lives so that we can be aware of those things. Awareness is the first step towards conquering that, whichever it is that afflicts us. He says, in all evil speaking. And he goes on to, again, that's sort of kind of a big package there to look at. He says, as newborn babes, desire the milk of the word that you may grow thereby, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is gracious. Okay, image of a baby. What is that baby? Innocent. Okay. What is that baby not? Not malicious, not deceitful, not hypocritical, and not envious, and so on and so forth. Why?
Hasn't learned them.
Because it hasn't learned it. It hasn't had the benefit of living yet and having to understand at some point later in its life, oh dear God, have mercy on me, a sinner. So he says to you and to me as an image that we should be slowly, probably, I don't know anybody that's reverted quickly, but in our nature, we return to an innocence. Thereby, we manifest the characteristics of a child, which is trust and faith. Because a child trusts that it's just food is going to be there. That its diaper is going to be changed quickly. And it lets you know if you don't do it quickly. It's that nature of a child that is, it hasn't learned all of the brokenness. And there is no sin within a newborn baby, It simply just has the brokenness that makes it easy to sin. That's just the reality of us coming into a broken world. Verse 9, the apostle says, "But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." It's why we as a community, when we gather at the table or we gather at the end for the blessing, it's why we all say it together, because we're a part of a nation of priests. Now, on a large scale, believers don't understand the priesthood, and therefore they don't put it into practice. What is the first obligation of a priest? Is to worship God. And what's the second? I think Rabbi Dan just said it. It's to intercede. It's prayer. It's offering sacrifices and to intercede for others. So those are the two primary goals or job descriptions for a priest, of which you and I are participatory in. He says that he's called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. What's darkness?
The world, sin.
The world, sin. What else? Our hearts. Yeah, there's darkness even still in our hearts. Night. Yeah, night's pretty dark. What happens in the nighttime if you don't have any light? And you're not wearing shoes or steel toe boots? You're going to stub your toe and fall. And it hurts, probably even more so than in the daytime because you can't see it coming. And so he uses these metaphors to teach us things. He's called us into glorious light. Now, when we come to faith, the part of our heart, the spiritual heart, is darkened. And when we come to faith, it's like it's reconnected to God. And it becomes filled with light. A little bit of light at a time until it fills us. Messiah says, if your eye is full of light, then your whole body is filled with light. But if our eye is filled with darkness, our whole body is filled with darkness. So, I used to use the dimmer switch, I think at one of the other places that we met, to kind of illustrate this. But it's a darkness with just a slight spark before we come to faith. And as faith grows, this light becomes more and more inside of us. And this is, again, our shedding sin and becoming more and more like our Father, who is the Father of light. Amen? So continuing, he says that we who were not a people, but are now the people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but have now obtained mercy. For, beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, and abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works which they observe glorify God in the day of visitation. Let's just be an example. You see, coming into faith in Messiah, if you were not born Jewish, you're part of Israel now, and you're no longer a part of the nations. You are a grafted in, full participatory person in this covenant. And so, a Jew who does not know Messiah is just as dead as somebody who wasn't born Jewish. But together, in God and through Messiah, we become and part of this strong branch or vine or part of whatever's growing from Messiah. What do you call a plant that's not attached to the main plant? Well, it's dead, but a weed. So we don't want to be weeds, but we want to be plugged in and attached to the one who gives life. Amen? So why do you think that the person who is a vine dresser plucks or cuts off some of the sprouty thingies that come off of it?
The reason why you prune it is because you want the growth to go into producing the fruit,
Okay.
and not just the leaves.
Okay.
And a vineyard will always grow wild if you leave it unattended. Even
Okay.
1 year,
Yeah.
it will become very wild.
All right.
And the longer it's left, the harder it is to get it back. You can get a severe pruning.
So when you prune the leaves, you give more strength to the fruit.
Yes, I'm having the vine put the energy into the fruit rather than into the leaves.
Grow leaves.
You have to have some,
Sure.
because the leaf bringing the sunshine and bringing the nutrients from that in order to strengthen the fruit and the vine itself.
Right.
So you don't want to over prune it,
Right.
and you'll stress it too much.
And then it won't produce.
Stress is okay though.
Yeah. Well, Baruch Hashem, because he certainly provides us that sometimes. Yes. There's so many spiritual truths that he gives to us through physical examples. So we could almost say that less show and more fruit. You have to have some deeds, but the fruit that comes from this path has to be that of the Spirit, which is what? The fruit of the Spirit is what? Love, joy, peace, patience, all the good stuff. Yeah. So, again, some of the physical examples. The little book of Haggai, which is back a few chapters. Actually, it's quite a ways back from where I was. It's page 1359 in my version, which is not my favorite version. But anyway, Haggai, one of the prophets, he says in chapter 1, in verse 5, he says, "Therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways." Anybody else have a different translation? Give careful thought to your ways. I've in one of the other translations that I read earlier, it said, "Know your ways." What are our ways? Okay, the ways in which we should walk, yes. What could we broadly say that our ways are? Our deeds, exactly. That's it. It's what we do. In the broad sense, he says, "Know your ways." What is it that we do? And some of that it's really good because you go, man, I am such a nice person, and I'm kind to people. And look, I just bought somebody lunch yesterday, and I let that person that wanted to get over in front of me, I let them get over without throwing a fit and going, I was nice, God. But he also says, take note of your ways. I mean, that encompasses the stuff that we're not so proud of. Sometimes it's deeds, and sometimes it's thoughts, sometimes it's words that we blurt out on the road, sometimes. And we have to take note of that because our deeds show us where we are. It's not wrong to feel good about doing something kind and good for people. It is good. That's one of the blessings of blessing people is we feel good by doing it. But we also have to take stock of the things that we go, oh, I'm so glad my mom wasn't watching, right? I'm so glad that my child didn't hear me say that. It's about being honest. And if we are to grow in the faith, it has to be rooted in this honest assessment that we have to grow in. And it's part of the process. But he says, know your ways. All throughout the scriptures, both in the Hebrew scriptures and in the Greek scriptures, together as one compilation, there is this knowing ourselves. In Hebrew, the word to know is yada. And yada is used in a word in a broad sense for knowing. And for knowing, when we think about it, we think right here, right? But to know in Hebrew implies an action as well as a knowledge. It is something generally that is used very intimately in certain parts of the scriptures. But it's more than just an intellectual amassing of knowledge. It is a merging of action and thought or knowledge. In Greek, the word is gnosis. And gnosis, everywhere you read in the New Covenant scriptures, where the apostle says to know, He's using a word from the root, or is the actual word gnosis. Anybody ever heard that word before?
Is that with a G?
It is with a, it's generally, right? Prognosis, yeah. What is a prognosis?
A report
Yeah.
of something that's going on with you.
Right.
Or your
Prognosis is the doctor tells us something, so we know. So gnosis is a common word throughout the Greek scriptures, and it is something that is good. Of course, at later points, we find that there were in the books of John and others, where he writes against false Gnostics, those that basically perverted the truth, the true knowing, with their variety of heresies. So it's not a bad word. It's just a word that has to be placed into its proper context. But so the prophet says to know your ways, to understand your ways. 2 Peter chapter 2. Second Peter chapter 2. Double dip, Joe. It's my nightmare to get mishmashed between the two different Peters. All right. Let's turn over to Philippians chapter 1. I definitely know there's only one of those, right? Philippians. Mm-hmm. Philippians chapter 1. In verse 21, the apostle says, "For me to live is Messiah, and to die is gain. For if I live on in the flesh, this will remain fruit for my labor. For yet what I shall choose I cannot tell. For me to live is Messiah, but for me to die is gain." What did he mean by that? For me to live is Messiah. What is that?
The only purpose in life, the only value of life is to live for Messiah.
Okay. What else? Anyone else have a different perspective on that? For me to live is Messiah. I think it kind of building on what Rabbi Dan said is he didn't want to live anymore just for himself. He didn't live to get up the next day to make tents or whatever else he was doing at the time. He's not recorded there. And he didn't get up to eat per se. It's not to say he didn't have any favorite foods. I'm sure he did. But he didn't give up just to eat, to make money, to buy stuff. That wasn't why he lived. He lived because he wanted to show forth Messiah. Was the apostle perfect? No, he'd be the first person to tell you that. He might say something to you or me that at some point in his journey that he's not proud of. And you know what? He would apologize. And he would ask for forgiveness because he himself was growing and changing. He didn't start so nice, did he? He was zealous for God, but he did stuff in a very wrong way for God. And he thought he was doing the right thing. I mean, that's what you do with heretics, right? You round them up and persecute them, kill them. I mean, isn't that what... Well, he found out later that wasn't what you do. And sometimes the people that you think are heretics are a little further along the path than you are. It's a you could say a litmus test or a stopping point for us to go, oh, yeah, maybe that's the case. And we begin to have different perspectives. We begin to see people a little differently. We may be critical of people for a variety of things, but as we grow, he begins to show us things that we did not know or see. But he says, for me to die is gain. Man, when we die as believers in faith, it's the best gain you can ever imagine. What happens? You're pure before God. And you're in his presence, which is pretty awesome. To say it in a very tongue-in-cheek way, which defies all explanation. We're with God at that point after we pass from this life as faithful believers. So that was really amazing. But he knew that he was being prolonged in this journey for the benefit of others, because he wanted to go be with God. He had seen Messiah. He'd spoken with Messiah. He probably spoke to him at different points. He very humbly describes a point in which he ascended to heaven. He says, I know a man in Christ, because he was humble enough not to say, oh, by the way, yeah, I've been to heaven. He was humble enough to say, it was this person that I knew who was in heaven and heard and saw things that cannot be described. And that was probably made him even more longing to be in that place. Have we been touched by things or visions or things that we have that God has given to us? Keep them, hold them, treasure them in your heart, because they're there for your benefit, to make you long for our homeland even more. He says, continuing, that for if I live on the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor, yet I cannot choose I shall choose what I shall choose, I cannot tell. For I am hard pressed between the two, having a greater desire to depart and be with Messiah, which is far better, but nevertheless to remain in the flesh is more needful for you. And being confident of this, I know that I shall remain and continue with you for all your progress and the joy of your faith, that your rejoicing for me may be more abundant in Messiah Yeshua by my coming to you. Now he's talking about being a part of people's lives. Who do you minister to? Children? Grandchildren? Siblings? Co-workers? You too are placed in people's lives to bless them and benefit them. And they're going to be blessed and benefited by sometimes seeing us make mistakes and seeing how we deal with those things. There was a misunderstanding at my work yesterday, and I thought, I'll just handle it on Monday. But I got to my other store, and I was there, and I was doing stuff, and I was like, oh, I have to leave this. And I walked away, and I went to the other store, and I dealt with the problem because I knew it would bug me throughout the whole weekend. Because I saw this person, and I knew that this thing was bothering them. Now, and I, to the best of my ability, I made that problem right. And at the end of the conversation, I got a fist bump, because that's what we do now, right? In the modern society, it's fist bump. And the person was different at the end, after that conversation. I apologized for my mistake that I had made. And the conversation was different. And I felt better, and he felt better, and it was good. So we have to know and be able to understand that, sometimes this is why we're in people's lives. And if it's in a work setting, if it's in a home setting, you're there for somebody else. We're not just walking this path for our own benefit. That's not how God works. He says, continuing, only let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of Messiah, so that whether I come to you or see you or am absent, or I hear of your affairs, that you may stand fast in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel. What is the gospel? How do we stand fast in it? What is the message of the gospel? Good news. What's the good news?
Jesus Christ is Lord, and came and gave his blood to save us.
Yep. He has come.
He's risen.
He has come. He has taught. He has died. And Baruch Hashem, he has risen. Again, that is the simplest form of the gospel. God restores us to fellowship. God restores us to fellowship to himself through himself and sacrificing himself. And so he says to you and to me, will you sacrifice yourself to bring others into fellowship with me? You see, because as we walk this path, we are to be little messiahs in that sense. We exemplify. He carried a cross, and he says, now you take up your cross. He says, you've received mercy, and you be merciful. So we are to show forth the nature of God through our own, sometimes broken ways, but hopefully becoming more and more a reflection of our Father. He says, and not in any way terrified by your adversaries, which of them is proof of perdition, but to you of salvation, that it is from God. For to you has been granted on behalf of Messiah not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake. Wait a minute. Did a lot of Christians not read this part? To suffer for his sake? Because, right, I mean, if you're suffering, there's something wrong with you, right? Well, no. If we're suffering, sometimes it's because God's using it as a part of our transformation. If you tell a believer in China or in Egypt, you're just not doing it right because you're suffering. What? You don't have anything? Well, you must be in sin, as they kill our brothers and sisters in Egypt. What did they do wrong? No, they were a faithful witness. What they had, stuff-wise, it didn't matter. They were faithful witnesses to the truth of the gospel. If you read any follow-up articles to the story that Mike shared a few weeks back, those places that were bombed and killed, that bus that was bombed full of children, do you know what those Coptic Christians, those Egyptian Christians did? They forgave the Muslims. They forgave, and their children were dead. That is only by the Spirit of God can that happen. Only by the power of God, which knows that those children are not dead, but are in a place where they are truly more alive. They forgave. And you know what that does? It breaks down the bondages of Satan within the hearts of those that are enslaved. And I believe that by the blood of those children, that many faithful believers will come from the Muslims. Because they say, man, we wouldn't forgive you. We try to kill you even more. But he uses the blood of the martyrs to build his community throughout this earth and throughout the history. So it is an anomaly which doesn't make sense. Because if we get hurt, we want to hurt, right? I mean, if somebody hurts us or our children, then we want to get them back. But he says to you and to me, that's not my way. You killed my son, but I forgave you. And I not only forgave you, I made you my children. This is the message of the gospel, which is powerful, transcendent, and ever living. He says in chapter 2, if there's any consolation in Messiah, if there's any comfort or love or fellowship of the Spirit, any affection and mercy, fulfill my joy by being like-minded, having the same love, being in one accord and one mind. Who's he speaking to? Is he speaking to unbelievers? What's that? Speaking to believers in this congregation in Philippi. He was saying, when you come together, you're going to have problems. Why? Because there's more than one of you. He says, utilize the Spirit of God to deal with your own stuff. And when you rub up against each other and butt heads, and maybe even slash a little bit, forgive, apologize, humble yourselves. And this is the mark of his communities all over the world, all throughout time, is this supernatural reality when we forgive people, when we humble ourselves before them. Sometimes even we don't want to. We know, and it's killing a part of ourselves which really wants to be right. Right? We want to be right? Right? No, it's this death to self. And slowly we become something different. We become merciful and kind. Something that is drastically different than so many places on this earth. He says, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you not look only for his own interests, but for the interests of others. That's the nature of God, is to look out for others. He says, let this mind which be in you, which is also in Messiah Yeshua, who being in the form of God did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation. And taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of a cross. He may not have known how he would die. Maybe he did. I don't know. I don't presume to figure out what he knew and what he didn't. But he knew at some point in his consciousness that he was going to die as a sacrifice. And he lived every day, probably with that knowledge. But he didn't stop and say, oh, woe is me. I'm going to be a martyr for God. He tried to live every day victoriously. And you know what? When he was sad, and was he sad sometimes? What did he do? He prayed. He stepped aside. And he went aside and he went in communion and prayer with God. And he engaged God because he felt the weight of this flesh, which is real. He knew what it was like to despair, but he didn't allow it to control him. He cried so much and felt such anguish before he died that blood, it says, came from him. So he wasn't a person who was absent to suffering or struggle. He walked the path, and he walks right beside you and me today. He says that he was obedient even to the death of a cross. Therefore, God has highly exalted him in giving him a name which is above every name, that at the name of Yeshua every knee should bow, and those of heaven and those on earth and those under the earth, that every tongue should confess that Messiah Yeshua is the Lord, to the glory of the Father. Oh, there's going to be some that will confess it in this world and in the other world. Some in the other world that aren't happy about it. Every demon will bow and will confess that he is God. They may not like it, but it's inexplicable, and they will confess it. Doesn't change anything for them, but he is Lord. It just is a reality that every knee will bow before him, willingly or not. I want to choose willingly. I don't know about you. And sometimes it's trying to kneel willingly, and sometimes it's struggling to get up because the part of me doesn't want to. And that's the struggle that we all face is, will we be obedient to him? Or will we struggle with him? Will we demand freedom? Or will we find freedom in the parameters he's given to us? By the way, that's the holy way, the straight path. We all struggle and trip sometimes upon the path, and sometimes we fall off it, but it is incumbent upon us to rise up and step back upon the path. Chapter 4, I'll close here. Chapter 4. Please tell me there's a chapter 4. Okay, there it is. Okay, good. Chapter 4 and verse 4. Eventually. He says, "Rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice. Let your gentleness be known among all men, for the Lord is at hand." What did he say? Let your pride be known among all men? Let your great voice be known among all men? Your cleverness? What does he say is noteworthy of his disciples? Gentle spirit. Otherwise termed as meekness. Sometimes confused with weakness, but meekness is the nature of humility. Moses was called the most meek or most humble, at least at that point, of all people. He had his good days and he had his bad days. David, the prophet king, was called a man after God's own heart. And he had his good days and he had his really bad days. But they both had, and all of the prophets and all of the righteous ones throughout time to this very moment and will in the future have the one inexplicable quality is they did not give up. And they continued. They persevered in this life. We all will have times in which we are discouraged. Sometimes you look into the mirror of your heart and you go, oh my God. Okay, step 1. Step 2 is grieving about it. Step 3, accepting it, that it is true. And 4 or 5 or 6, I don't know, I lose track of all the steps, is doing something about it. To know thyself means that we see the good and the bad. We give glory to God for the good. We take ownership of the bad. And we say, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Amen? He says, continuing in verse 8, finally, brothers and sisters, Whatever so things are true, whatever things are of noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, and whatever things are of a good report, if there is any virtue, and if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. Focus upon the things of God. Nurture, drink from the vine so that you can bear fruit, that I can bear fruit. Let him clip off the leaves that don't need to be there anymore. It hurts. I think that they've said that the plants can scream that as the leaves are being cut. I don't know. I haven't asked a plant recently. But it does hurt sometimes when he prunes us. What is the goal of the vine dresser? Stronger fruit. Why? Because he wants to eat grapes? No, because he loves the result. And the result is beautiful. What does a very good vine dresser do? Does he eat all the grapes himself? No, he gives that fruit sometimes. Mike and Elaine gave me this really, really yummy grape juice, which I have to put on a shelf and look at for a few more days. But it is the fruit of labor. You see, our lives aren't just meant for us to amass all this good stuff and feel good about it. It's to give. Because fruit benefits others. That's the fruit of our lives. Abba Joseph said the most easy, brief, and safe path to heaven is humility. All the saints, through humility, were elevated, honored, glorified, and made wondrous and sanctified by God. If you take away humility, no one would be a saint. Amen? Let us be people of God who strive to put his words into practice, to seek humility, which is the mother of all virtues, and everything else flows from this. To be people that don't just know, but know. Amen. Let us pray. Abba, we thank you for this great and beautiful gift that you have given to us. Father, may we take to heart, Father, even the hard words, even the things that we struggle against, but knowing that it is you, the master vine dresser, looking to produce in us the most beautiful fruit that can be possible through these lives. May we submit ourselves to you. May we be kind and merciful. May we seek to serve others and show your ways to this world. We love you and praise you, and may your name be extolled and glorified and honored in both worlds to the ages of ages. Amen.